Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a very exciting panel. Today we'll be talking about the future of the electricity business and what that looks like. We have an awesome panel of speakers here who are going to be sharing their background and policy and also utility side and looking at innovation and technology. I just want to give a brief background about myself. I'm a tech scout out in Booz Allen Hamilton in the San Francisco Innovation Hub. I help lead and develop our venture strategy at the time, and also I'm working in the climate change sustainability space. I've done a lot of consulting with public sector clients, looking at their sustainability plans and how we're adopting technologies, but also stay up current with everything that we've been doing. So without that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. So to my left, we have Cristin Lyons here at partner with the ScottMadden. So introduction.
Sure, I'm a partner with ScottMadden and I lead our firm's energy practice. We're general management consultants specializing in energy, and I work primarily with electric and gas utilities.
And then we also have Pete Curtice to the left here, who's a who is also Duke Fuqua grad, and he's a partner at Modern Energy and CEO of American Efficient.
Hi, thanks for having me today. Modern Energy is located about 3 miles from here in downtown Durham, about a 50-person firm, and we are a clean tech asset management firm, if you had to encapsulate it in one sentence, which some examples, we have solar development company in South America, we have a DER business in the United States, and we have a skunkworks sort of algorithmic trading business here in Durham as well.
Thank you. And then we also have Adrienne Lalle.
Hi, good to see y'all. I am with Edison. I'm a project manager in our Utility of the Future group. What that is it's sort of a strategy group, but we sit within operations and we take the policy goals, the high-level policy goals, for example, 3 gigawatts of energy storage, and develop the strategy and how to operationalize that strategy for the ops groups to then execute. Oh, and we serve the 5 boroughs of New York City and Westchester, so very dense, like 30 million customers, but small geographic area.
Awesome. And then finally we have Dionne Delli-Gatti, sorry about that, Southeast Director of Clean Energy and Environmental Defense Fund.
Hi, I'm Dionne. As she said, I do policy and regulatory work in the climate and clean energy space here in the Southeast. That is primarily at the state level, but we do have pretty heavy engagement with municipalities throughout North Carolina as well. Those that have made some sort of climate or renewables commitment, and trying to help them identify and remove the systemic barriers that they face to achieving those goals.
Wonderful. So I want to start off with this question. What innovation or trend that you're seeing that you're most excited about in the next 10 years in the electricity business?
I'll jump in. Storage is a game changer. And I think as we continue to see storage deployments, successful pilots, incentives around them, we're going to continue to see those costs come down. And it's going to change the way we operate the grid, and frankly, what the grid is capable of in terms of serving customers. Sorry to steal your thunder.
No, it's okay. I have a backup answer.
I would concur. I think storage is, there's lots of facets of it, but storage paired with other renewable resources is the game changer. I think when we say storage, when I say storage and I say renewables, the real issue is that costs have gone down to such a level and will continue to go down that I believe, no matter what market forces, regulatory forces might be impeding progress, eventually those will be run over just because the cost and the reliability will catch up to a point where it's really the only viable way to go, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah. So I've been working on new business models for energy storage for the last 3.5 years with Con Edison to try and kind of address some of those barriers and challenges. But one of the things I'm seeing maybe 10 years down the road that we're starting to think about at Con Edison is the idea of the distributed system platform and what sorts of creating a true market for services that the utility might traditionally provide to the customers but creating a market for third-party assets to actually provide that, and what the utility's role is, and how we enable that to ultimately provide, kind of ARC, affordable, reliable, and clean. And so what does that platform look like? What is the utility's role, and how can third parties help provide those services as our infrastructure continues to age, as we hear prosumers saying they want, more control over their energy? How do you create the market functions to actually enable that and make sure that you're doing it in a strategic way that drives down costs and still ensures reliability?
Yeah, I think similarly, it's storage for me, but some of what gets talked about a lot less than storage and renewables is storage and demand side management. Duke Energy in Eastern North Carolina and Asheville over the past few years did the Blue Horizons project, which came about because there was a lot of pushback for adding new generation in Asheville. And so the community and the utility all came together and put together a plan that paired some programs on demand side management and getting some low-income customers, homes, more energy efficient, and then it also strategically paired storage, and it significantly delayed the time that plant would go online, and it also reduced the amount of capacity that they would have to do. And I would love to see more projects like that start to address regional issues. We're also seeing some of these type of creative solutions in some of the co-ops. In the Southeast, the co-ops have a little bit more flexibility to be nimble and creative because they're not regulated to the same degree that the monopolies are. And so they're doing some of these things too. Roanoke Electric is doing some of the same type of things where one program builds upon another. Their energy efficiency program, the savings for that sort of rolls into their community solar program. Then the profits from that are now rolling into some electric vehicle school bus programs, which then will have battery capacity that will have vehicle to grid opportunities. So I think that that type of integration of storage beyond just with renewables is really exciting.
And that's a really important point too, is that there's a high energy burden on underserved communities. And so what are you guys' kind of thoughts about like how utilities are reframing their business approach, or how they're, a lot of the studies that have been done have shown that in the Southeast region, that's where a lot of the high energy burden is. So how do you guys see the future addressing that?
So I'll take a crack at it. And I think Adrienne, in her ARC comment, talked about the importance of keeping electricity affordable for everyone. And utilities continue to have an obligation to serve in the world that we live in. So the question becomes, how can you start to introduce, whether it's new technology or other types of innovation, to these utilities that all of their costs end up on the ratepayer? So how do you do that in a measured way? And importantly, focus innovation on things that are going to enable lower cost solutions. So you're kind of describing the tension that regulated entities face in this environment. And I think it depends on the company that you're talking about. Every state is different in terms of the way they're incenting this behavior. Pilot programs, I think, are extremely valuable in teaching lessons learned. Where is this not going to succeed versus where will it? And utilities actually talk a lot to each other about what's working in terms of making the grid more efficient and cost effective.
Adrienne, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so we're actually doing a lot of things, and I think one of the reasons that I chose to work in New York is that they have at least recognized that a lot of these problems do have business solutions. So to Cristin's point, we're incredibly path dependent. We have billions of dollars of infrastructure already in the ground, and we are trying to innovate and also address some of these legacy problems that admittedly, are part of our fault without massively in a measured way that does not massively increase the cost to our customers. And so we do that through a number of things. we actually have EAMs, which are earnings adjustment mechanisms, that are actually, increase our rate of return if we specifically provide renewables, energy efficiency, kind of, and lowering emissions in environmental justice areas. So that's a way that the commission has worked with us to provide that incentive for us to spend more money on targeted communities. The other thing is our non-wires solutions. They're also known as non-wires alternatives, but we can't call them NWAs for exactly the reason you are thinking of. I am not kidding. Sitting in a commission meeting about that was one of the funniest highlights of my career. That do target, what you're talking about is instead of building more infrastructure, looking at the load pockets where there is, that dirty peaker or extra emissions, and coming up with these portfolio of third-party solutions, including demand response, including energy efficiency, and including storage installed in the right business model, which we can get into later, that actually help offset the runtime of those peakers, reduce the emissions, and specifically target those areas. So I think you can do it. The commission has rightly noticed or agreed to help provide us the incentive to do it differently. I think the challenge is going to be, to Cristin's point, doing it in a measured way, but we do have kind of these portfolio of tools that we're starting to use to address these specific segments of our customer market and it still ensure reliability.
Yeah. So Dionne, I'm just mentioning that those portfolio tools, do you see this often kind of incorporated at the regional, or have you seen, what kind of changes and impact have you seen that in what you've been working on?
So I'm sorry.
Oh, how you prioritize those changes, those tools being offered, and seeing that impact. Have you seen the change in where the region that you're focusing on, and how that's been impacting?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You're starting to see it, like you were saying, emerge in pilot projects. In one of the most recent rate cases here in North Carolina, we're seeing a pilot for a low-income rate design and things of that nature. I think, as we evolve and you have businesses growing demands for clean energies because of their corporate responsibility, a lot of the drive for renewables, we heard from PJM at a different conference earlier in the week, and the bulk of the drive for renewables that are going online in PJM, at least according to this one expert, is that it's corporate demand. And so how we balance the C&I customers' needs with the low income, and so that they're not burdened, especially if we start to see technologies evolve to the point where we start to get grid defection. And then you're going to really see these overburdened communities facing an economic, struggle that is going to take a whole new system.
As the token utility person, can I just make a comment? So there's a difference between grid defection and load defection.
Yes.
And I think one of the problems that we see, particularly around this issue, is that communities will load defect, i.e. they won't pay revenue to us. They won't pay their rates because they are, netting out their cost of revenue. But they're still using our wires, and we still have to maintain those wires. They're still using the grid. And so the issue that we have, and when I made that, kind of offhanded comment about installing storage in the right business model, is that when they load defect without grid defecting, those costs then do get shifted onto the communities that are not avoiding costs through solar, through storage, because we do have to, recoup our costs. And so the undue burden is actually being placed on the people who cannot afford to install those types of microgrids or load reducers.
Absolutely, and that was what the point I was trying to get
exactly,
to. Because I think you're not going to see the communities defect, but where as these technologies become more affordable and all of that, whether it's from a backup capacity or for other purposes, I think it's the it's the C&I customers.
It's exacerbating kind of the core issue.
And Pete, I know that you've had a lot of different experiences in working with distributed energy resources, but what is kind of your insight about engaging with the communities and helping to encourage that, this high energy burden on those that can't afford? How do we address those with those distributed energy sources?
Well, I wish it were an easy solution, at least from my perspective. I do think there's some levers that could make an impact. Number one, energy efficiency is cheaper than everything. So in every conceivable market structure, energy efficiency wins as the cheapest resource. Now, it's not baseload, and so it is never, we're obviously never gonna have energy efficiency be the entire solution, but there's a long way to go before with energy efficiency as a resource before we get to a point where it has any issues along reliability. I do think the big industrial defection issue is very, very real, and it puts I think a lot of the big tech firms are making very strategic moves to put undue pressure on electric utilities to sort of step up their policy game and their rate game almost as a threat. I don't think they actually intend or potentially don't intend to defect, but they want utilities to think that they could. Yeah. And in some cases they really could, and in many cases they could not. But part of that I think is maybe could be considered bullying, but it also, to use a glass half full way of looking at it, it really will probably force utilities to think about ways to have that not happen. Mm-hmm. And I think there are ways that it is not inevitable that these big tech firms and the folks that do have the ability to pay will migrate away.
That's a great point. And just mentioning about, that investments in those tech, like what kind of, we had mentioned about energy storage. Do you see like another area where their investment should be geared towards to help utilities to address that?
Towards what types of investments?
Oh, so for in terms of like how tech is responding to it. So being in San Francisco, we see all these startups that are working in this space, what they're doing to address, maybe partner with utilities. But have you seen like a success story, or where you see that going that direction?
Well, if you take a look at, I know a bunch of people at Google that run energy policy, and there's other big well-funded firms that are doing this, where they're going 100% renewable and buying up the rights to renewable assets all over the country. And I do think there's a way, like, let's be clear, we were talking about this at lunch, moving to renewables across the board for all practical purposes is not an engineering problem. Like, there is absolutely a quite straightforward way to do this. The trick is in all the policies and the monopolistic territories and sort of fiefdoms, and I say that without judgment because these things were put into place with good reason, and to Cristin's point, we've had reliable, cheap energy that is not a significant portion of most people's, not all people, but most people's month. Our phone bill is more than our energy bill. That's crazy, right?
Starbucks bill is more than our energy bill. Mike.
Exactly. So when you think about it in those terms, you're like, wow, this is really amazing that they've built this thing. But especially in the United States, there is absolutely an engineering way to get all of our energy from wind and solar throughout the center part of the country very reliably and transmit it to the urban population zones on the East Coast. Now, it's not easy to get there or fast, but it's absolutely doable. And if we do that, costs over time will come down for everybody.
And so how do you think companies themselves are holding themselves accountable for these decarbonization goals and these commitments? Because we say we're going to be 100% clean or 100% renewable. I'm interested in hearing what you've been experiencing and say we can actually meet these commitments, because then that also is within a box itself. And from understanding from my background and the work that I've done with clients, a lot of times they were saying that we're 100%, but actually we're trading. And so interested in hearing your thoughts.
So a fun fact for you all, if you take 2018 retail energy in the US and you articulate all of the clean energy commitments that have been made to date, 30% of retail energy will be clean by 2050, just based on commitments we've seen to date, which is substantial. Not everyone believes all the commitments, but so part of it is that there's definitely a groundswell around these types of commitments that are made very publicly. But I think we also need to be careful in terms of how these commitments are defined. So you can have a 100% RPS goal, all renewables. You can have a clean energy goal, which means you're going to include hydro and nuclear. Or you can have carbon neutral, which means you're also going to look at carbon sequestration, storage, other uses for it. So there's a lot of, depending upon who's speaking, wiggle room in terms of those commitments. But there's also been intentional language to say, we're not saying we're 100% carbon free. We're saying that to the extent that we generate carbon, we're going to do something with it and it's not going to end up in the atmosphere. So in terms of whether these organizations will hold themselves to the commitments is one question. I think the bigger question and the more pertinent one is the degree to which their customers now hold them to those commitments. And I do believe that that's going to be the big driver.
So Dionne, I know that you've been working in this space, and so I just wanted to hear more about like the commitments and what you've seen at the state and the city level.
Yeah, I mean, and it's continuing to emerge. We started a project about 1.5 years ago with initially 12 cities who'd made carbon and renewable commitments here in North Carolina. That's and the initial intent was to identify barriers to achieving that. And now now that they've been identified, we're in a phase of trying to find solutions to those, and we've expanded to almost 24 cities and counties that are trying to do that. And I think it's going to be multifaceted. It's an evolution of technology, improvements, the costs coming down. I do think some of our regulations need to be looked at. In North Carolina, in the public interest means cost and reliability. Yet we have hurricanes, we have all of these weather issues that are exacerbated by climate change. So do we need to reevaluate what in the public interest means? We have a regulatory system that was designed for a problem that no longer exists. It was intended to get power to the communities where it was needed, and we had the rural co-ops that supplemented in the areas where the big utilities didn't, it wasn't cost effective for them to go. That's not our problem now. Nobody builds a house and says, I can't get electricity here. And so we have a new problem, and it is, the climate change issues that we're facing, what are the risks that are associated with that to the utility, to the community. I think as we continue to see insurance companies integrate climate risk into their evaluations, that will dramatically change the business model, more so even than what policy drivers might do. When you can't insure an asset, you're going to start looking at new assets.
Brings great points. So that brings to the next conversation that I would like to hear more about how you're preparing and making sure it's resilient, in the infrastructure, and what can the utilities do, or should they be engaging more with, with these tech firms, or how are they addressing this climate resiliency? And just keeping on point, last week I went to this Bloomberg ESG talk when we were talking about how you can, make sure you address the environmental part of it, the social and the governance, and it's all impacting how we're building the future. And so this is really an interesting topic that I would like to, see what you guys are each working on and how that's helping with the electricity business.
Someone else want to go first? I'm happy to jump in. Go ahead.
So I can talk about this. So everybody remembers Superstorm Sandy. That obviously hit our territory incredibly hard. One of the things that shocks people, especially given the recent blackout in New York, is we're actually, I think, the most, if not the second most, reliable utility in the country. We are built to a second redundancy, which means N-2, which means any two pieces of equipment can fail, and you're still able to meet the peak load. It's one of the reasons that New York rates are so expensive. The other is that 85% of our system is underground. And so for the majority of our system, it is actually already storm hardened. That being said, moving forward, I think there are a couple of things that we've started to do to take that a step further, because we have seen, the effects of increasing climate change and what happens when that 100-year storm comes and Manhattan is an island. It got washed over. So one of the things we have to think about, pick your storm hardening cost. We have to build literal moats around our transformers and build submersible pieces of electronic equipment, which is mind-blowing if you think about it. The other thing that we have to do in terms of hardening, I think, is really think about how we manage the system. So not to harp on the DSP, but the more visibility and the more control you have over each individual section of your system. And again, because we are built to second redundancy, I think that we probably, if we have the tools and the technology, I know it's kind of less sexy to be like, we really need the IT software and the visibility into every single switchgear and breaker, but if you have that ability, you can then manage when certain parts of the system go out, you can redirect power from one to another to help try and support that grid. And so I think it's, we're doing the infrastructure we're already pretty much underground, but building the moats, switching out everything with submersible electronics. And then the other is really investing in managing the grid more dynamically. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest areas that we can improve upon. And as we move towards this huge 3 gigawatt goal of storage, making sure that a portion of that, we're not just doing storage to hit a policy goal, and so putting it wherever we can, but really strategically placing it on the system for where it could make the most benefit in a blackout type situation.
What I would add is that many utilities, at the transmission level, utilities typically plan to N-2 across the country, and that's an annual process. Everybody looks at from the transmission owners up through the RTOs and ISOs. The challenge I think that we have in resiliency today is that reliability planning only goes so far, at which point you really need to consider how much do you want to spend to prevent the lights from going out, and then how does the expenditure and community collaboration need to evolve to address the events that we're seeing. And I think the cost issue is right in the middle of this, because you could probably build a grid somewhere that could withstand any contingency. We couldn't afford to turn the lights on. So where that line is, I think we need a construct within which we can have that conversation at the community level, at the state level, and I would argue at the federal level as well.
One of the things that we've all read about what's been happening in California with the wildfires and the planned blackouts, and that's terrible on every level, and I feel horrible both for customers and for the utilities, and there's no right or wrong, it's just bad. But we have a board member that lives out there, and he was out last week, and what he said is, he said, I didn't even know, because he happens to have battery storage on his property, and yes, he can afford it, and not many people can, but that's not going to be the case for too much longer. And so I think it doesn't have to be, I'm completely off the grid and doing this all myself, or I'm completely on the grid and I'm only counting on the grid. There is going to be a combination that will drive better resiliency and lower cost over time. I have a car that sits in my garage most of the time that has a 100 kilowatt battery in it. I have other things. I happen to have all the electric stuff, but I have batteries, a lot of batteries, and we're not using it for anything. And that's, I'm on the sort of fringe of that stuff, but that won't be the case for very long. These costs are coming down, and whether it's storage just for emergencies and resiliencies, where there used to be diesel generators to do those kinds of things, that will benefit the entire grid, and hopefully will drive down the cost of needing to have that extra layer of resiliency in some ways. And there'll be tons of different business models that will evolve out of this reduction in cost. And the utility doesn't have to own it all, and private business doesn't have to own it all. It's probably going to be a partnership or a dividing of that in some way.
That's great that you mentioned that. And we do have some questions from the audience. And so on that point, do you think the U.S. will see large-scale deregulation in the next 5 to 10 years? What does that look like in terms of
Deregulation as in like what New York and California did, where it's more restructured, or dereg as in utilities lose their franchise?
Wholesale's already deregulated. So
yeah, so
we might need clarification on the question.
I'll tell you what I hope for. I'll just jump in.
It was pretty a broad question.
I think I hope that there's significantly more regulation in some avenues. I think there's a strong case for FERC taking a more dominant and strategic and dominant position across the country to allow some of the movement of what we could have in large-scale renewables to the coast. I mean, that should be their job.
And there's a framework for that.
And there's a
already.
framework for that. Like, it's there. It's just like you don't have to reinvent the whole thing. So that's a cause for sort of more top-down regulation. And I do think there are opportunities to deregulate supply but that doesn't mean necessarily, to Cristin's point over lunch, that doesn't mean completely deregulating and tearing apart the utility infrastructure and model. Like, you don't have to do that. But I think that there are some really good things that are happening around supply side decoupling from transmission and distribution that I hope will continue.
All right, Adrienne, for you?
So we're in a restructured market. We really only own T and D. We don't own any generation. So we're kind of, one of those states that is deregulated. And I agree with your point. I think what I would like to see is we took probably deregulation, and I'll put on my curmudgeon utility person hat for a second, a little too far. And so we've banned utilities from owning any generation. And I think that does end up actually having a reverse effect and driving up costs. And what I'd like to see is a truly free market where we are allowed to compete. And I think California does this with some of their storage projects for some generation type assets to see if we can do it more cost effectively. Why does it matter if it's the utility versus a third party? Isn't the whole point clean, affordable, and reliable? And so I would like to see, if we're going to talk about further deregulation, maybe movement in that direction, where it's really a free and open market. And more obvious subsidies, stop hiding them in rates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah?
I wonder, because we are here in North Carolina, we're in the Carolinas, and we're in a monopoly market here, and there is a lot of emerging and evolving conversation around whether or not that system is the most logical anymore. And I'm just curious if, maybe this question relates to that. The Clean Energy Plan here in North Carolina that was issued a month or so ago talks about doing a study as to whether or not going into a wholesale market might be a solution towards achieving the emissions goals that this state is looking for. I know the co-ops in South Carolina just recently joined PJM, which is interesting because they can't, right now, my understanding, and it's little, not even enough to get myself in trouble probably, I do believe they still have contracts tied up, but if the dynamic changes down there, it gives them opportunities to have more control if their reality changes or who owns those assets changes and things like that. There were bills introduced in both North and South Carolina over the past year to do RTO studies. And I don't think that was a one-time isolated consideration. I think there are a lot of interests that would really like to see that more deeply explored. Now, whether or not it's good or bad and will achieve any particular interest goals, there are different issues. PJM doesn't have a particularly good emissions profile. So for me, as an environmental advocate and one who works on climate change issues, that would be something that would really need to be seriously considered. And how could it be done? Could it be paired or matched with other policies, or by in sequence joining with RGGI or some other mechanism for controlling what might be emission spikes if you did that?
Yeah, and so on the emissions part, do you see the role of carbon tax being having a greater role in the future? Or what do you see in the plan of having a carbon tax?
I don't see a carbon tax as a viable solution. I think a cap on carbon with market mechanisms so that the market can kind of figure it out, possibly joining RGGI or something like that, is a better solution. I think that there's little to no political appetite for a carbon tax. But I think our organization definitely, supports market-based solutions to these things. And I think a declining cap, at least here on the state level right now, is what we're talking about, because the appetite for it at the national level just isn't there right now. But I think eventually we're going to have to address it on a national level.
Yeah, the New York Independent System Operator, the NISO, is actually looking at pricing carbon into the electricity prices. And I think that's going to be really interesting, in particular with the increased adoption of storage, because right now the dispatch of energy storage for a purely market function, they've seen this in California and some of our own modeling in New York, actually increases the emissions when you think about round-trip efficiencies of energy storage and when you charge and discharge in order to capture the max energy arbitrage. And so there is not, energy storage is supposed to enable cheaper and more efficient use of grid, which would, and cleaner, which would, presumably lower emissions. And it's not doing that right now because the carbon pricing, I don't know if it's a tax, I don't know if it's a, SO2 number that you add into energy, we're still struggling with that, but the market needs to line up. I completely agree, and we're trying to figure that out. This is one of the times that we're on the same side talking to the NISO, because right now they're conflicting signals.
And this is across the country. States are looking at this everywhere. Colorado is looking at it and looking at the just transition component. Pennsylvania and Virginia. Now I think New Jersey are all, in the mix of joining RGGI, and so it's a challenge. And I don't think there's a clear solution or a perfect solution. I think we think the best opportunity here in the Carolinas is probably to join RGGI first, and that broader market conversation I think is just emerging.
I wouldn't write off a carbon tax. I think it's by far the most elegant and straightforward way to address the problem, and I'm hopeful that there will be an appetite nationally in the not too distant future for. I agree with everything you all have said, and I think it would be hard today for sure. But I think we have to keep talking about it because it is the absolute right approach academically. And there was a guy that was actually the dean of the environmental school here many years ago named Bill Schlesinger, who actually was one of the first people to push for the carbon tax, and I think write about it in a deep and thoughtful way. He's got some great papers out there if you're ever interested. But I actually don't think in 5 years, I wouldn't be shocked if it's not in place.
Yeah, so we're running out of time, but I do want to share that, that's something you brought up with that at the national level, we're not there yet, but we're seeing a lot of push, right? At the local level, like how can you impact your local communities and help accelerate that and help us to meet targets and reduce our carbon footprint. So I do want to inspire our audience here, what is one key takeaway that you would like to provide to them to help them with their career or how they can locally help support their economy, engaging with the audience?
Okay. Adrienne, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I would say that if you are interested in problem solving, I believe that there is, and shocker, a fundamental place for the utility moving forward, regardless of whether it's all third-party owned assets, somebody has to own the wires. And a lot of the issues come from the path dependency of building out these billions of dollars of infrastructure assets. And so I see the challenge/opportunity. If you're interested in problem solving, this is what I do, is thinking up new business models to get us through that medium term. Like, we all know kind of what we want the future energy paradigm to look like. Everybody has a microgrid and they have solar panels. We're doing V2G, we're using Pete's Tesla, Prius, I don't know what you have, but like if there's an outage, we can tap his battery. how do you get there? And how do you do it without offloading massive costs onto your customers? And how do you do that without stranding billions of dollars of assets in the ground that you haven't recovered but are no longer using? And that transition, I think, is absolutely fascinating. It's incredibly interesting to work on. When I left Duke Energy to work for Con Edison, everyone told me I was crazy because the regulators are so insane in New York. They push you to do completely out-of-the-box things. I'm responsible for mobile trailers of lithium-ion batteries in New York. But if you lean into it, and I think the utilities are starting to, and we're lucky enough in New York to have regulators that are insane and forcing us to do it, which is great, because you lean into those challenges, you come up with really interesting kind of futuristic solutions that help balance all of, it's a multivariable like optimization function, and I think it's fascinating.
I think I would say, if anything, if you've spent the time here today, I hope that what you leave with is that the industry needs you, and the problem needs you. And so, if anything, I hope that everyone you've spoken with and the panels you've seen have convinced you that this is an issue and a problem worth spending your time on. And especially for you, those of you that are first years or early in your time, there's going to be some things that you're going to be presented with from a job perspective that don't matter and aren't going to be helpful at all to anybody in any reasonable way. Don't do those things. And it doesn't have to be energy. There's lots of issues that need smart people, passionate people's help. And I would say, what I would hope that you all do is spend a little bit of time that we all have on this earth doing something that matters to you guys, because there's ways, I think everybody here is testament to, there's ways to join being able to make a living and being deeply passionate about something and having an outsized impact on a problem. And that's what I think it's all about.
So the first speaker this morning talked about finding that confluence of your talent and your passion. And I've been lucky enough to be in this industry now for 20 years or so. And I haven't worked in the utilities, I've worked with them. And whatever you can say about utilities being challenging and the rest is that you'll never meet finer people on an individual basis. And they're full of people who want to do the right thing, but it's hard. The problems that we're talking about up here were never envisioned. Even 10 years ago, we would not have been having this conversation. So the opportunity to sit with really bright individuals who want to do things differently it gets me up in the morning. I'm lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Adrienne's organization, and there is no place I'd rather be as we're looking at the problems that this industry is trying to solve. So find that for yourself, and you're going to have a great career.
Yeah, I think, it's such a unique career path because energy touches every issue, right? If resiliency, hospitals, fire, police, the utility, the financial systems. I heard a tech company recently say their profits in every particular market track directly correlated with their energy cost, directly. And so no matter what your passion is, I think you can find it. To me, where we find and add the most value is when we can sit at a table with someone we maybe seemingly have a different perspective of. I think there's always a Venn diagram. There's always, an overlap. I work with clean energy advocates. I work with Duke Energy. All of these circles overlap somewhere. Start there and build out and see, what you can build upon from no matter how small of an overlap or a consensus you might have on any one particular issue. You'd be surprised on the amount of ripples and the amount of impact that it can make in other areas.
Thank you. So thank you to these wonderful panelists. It was wonderful to hear your insights and your perspectives on what the future will look like in the electricity business. And that being said, we're open to break.